The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. 360 Energy is a North American leader in energy and carbon reduction. Recently, we have launched the 360 Carbon Excellence Program, designed to make corporate climate change actions more effective and successful. For more information, check the link in our podcast description. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Nice to be back. That's perfect.
I love the overlapping.
That was just, John, we're going to have to practice this.
Yeah.
Now, we've done quite a few carbon episodes these last few weeks. We've done carbon tax, we've done carbon regulation, carbon offsets. Now we're talking about a bit of a blanket statement, monetizing carbon. So how do we feel about our episode today on monetizing carbon?
I think it's a very important subject matter that needs to be addressed and understood. I love the idea of monetizing carbon because, as our listeners know, I believe when that is understood and that pricing signal is understood by the consumer or client, with that information in mind, they can take steps if they choose to mitigate costs because of it. So I love the idea of monetizing carbon. Now, I'm pretty sure there's probably some darts being shot at me right now because people don't like it because it's an incremental cost they've never had to deal with in the past. But the world changes, and so we have to get at it. And I think it's a very important task that needs to be done. That's my belief. John, what's your thoughts?
I think you're right, because we know in business that unless something has a cost implication to it, it never has a high priority. That said, we are stepping into a really complex area of discussion today. And I think our listeners need to be aware that we might go off all sorts of directions in this. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had more, until we can actually say, because the number of times we talk with organisations and we talk about reducing carbon, and that the response is, well, it's going to be costing me money. Well, if the carbon has a value and you're reducing it, then you've got a saving. So, yeah, it's an important topic.
Well, I think you both alluded to the first answer, but can carbon be monetized?
Yes.
Yes.
So
Would you like a little more?
You could give me some more, or we can dive into the next question.
I think it can, but what this suggests, for it to be monetized, there has to be an economy, there has to be a marketplace, there have to be rates of exchange, there have to be rules, there have to be regulations, there has to be a whole lot of things coming with it. But in simple terms, and I think it's something we talked about when we were talking about this episode, if you can trade non-fungible tokens, NFTs, on works of art, then surely you can put value on carbon, and you can make that work.
Agreed. What are the advantages of monetizing carbon?
Well, I think it's what we said at the beginning, is the advantage of monetizing carbon is to engage society, engage clients on the value of an emission that they're actually putting to the atmosphere, so that they understand, okay, that's a cost that I'm now incurring because I'm putting it into it. I'm now going to look at mitigating that cost. What are the options that are available to me to do so? And so it will drive people to act. I think we stress that's the most essential. And then the other thing, which I think we talked about in our last podcast, there's actually an opportunity for customers or clients to make money in this business too, because they can also, whether they're sequestering in some fashion, that they have the ability of monetizing that activity. So it creates a market, which I think supply and demand. That's effectively what you're creating. John?
I don't think I want to add anything to it. It's the whole point of it. In simple terms, for business, it makes it real if it's got a value associated with it.
Yeah, the way I kind of see it is when you're creating a product, or you're completing a certain operation, there's a cost of energy, there's a cost of fuel, water, labor, material. There's cost to all of these things, but we don't really dive into the byproducts of them, the waste, the emissions, things like that. And even when we're talking end of life of a product, when that recycling happens or it goes to a landfill, things like that. And I think monetizing carbon really encaptures the life cycle of an operation or the life cycle of a product.
Yeah, what you're talking about there is what's sometimes referred to as the social cost of carbon, and that's taking the full impact of it on the environment and well, world and everything in its place. And I think we've got to be brutally honest here. Although Dave was saying, oh, people don't want this additional cost, the impact, the social cost of carbon, the social impact of carbon has always been there. It's just not been quantified. People have not chosen to quantify it. I'm just going to throw a little example in here. Something I was looking at is the UK government have published figures that they use for carbon in drawing up policy. And they did it on a basis of a low, central and high estimate. And just to give a feel for it, now the figures are in pounds sterling. And in 2018, their sort of central value was around about £13 sterling a tonne. And then they're projecting in 2030, 80 or £81 sterling per tonne. And the idea of that is that when they are then building policy, they've actually got a cost that they can put on the carbon amongst all the other things. Now, I think we'll come on later to discussing are those prices accurate or whatever else, but that's an example of how carbon can be given a price and it can lead to some impact. But that's at a high level, that's at government level.
I think John and I talked about this actually this week. I believe, we talked about the merits of having a carbon charge, and because it gets people's attention. I don't think, from our experience working with clients, I don't think they've internalized two things with climate change. I don't think they've really internalized the true costs that they're incurring. I don't think that's being captured in their organization, those costs of climate change. I don't think anyone's capturing that and saying, oh my gosh, look at how climate change is costing us. From my experience, that's not being done. And if the people are doing it, for corporations are doing, good on them. On the other side, I'm thinking they aren't reflecting on actual incremental business that actually has occurred because of climate change. And so because those two items aren't captured or reported or understood, the only way to get people to do something on climate change is putting a carbon cost to it. And I think that's, if clients were different and they were tracking all these other things, then I think they'd be motivated, but I don't think they have the internal mechanisms to capture that currently. So carbon charges are the way to motivate people to do something.
It's interesting you're touching on that, because talking about what there is effectively an internal pricing of carbon. And I was looking at a report from the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP. It was in 2017, I will say that. But they said then that 1,400 companies had disclosed to CDP that they had either in place or were going to put in place internal carbon pricing. And they suggest that over 100 of the global Fortune 500 companies are included in that. I take that in good faith, but have we seen much of that? Perhaps we're not dealing with those 1,400 companies, and how much of it is an intent and how much of it is a practice. And then the other angle that's going to come on that, and I will just run on this if I can, is that there are 4 ways that they could price their carbon internally. The first is to use externally published sources of prices, and I'll come back to that. They could have an internal bespoke price, something that they make up. They could then have an implicit price, which is based on sort of having a carbon management program within the company. And then we come back to, and it would be the highest cost, and it's the one that Lysandra was picking up on, is the social cost of carbon. Okay, that sounds good. So externally published sources. So let's just have a quick look. Yesterday, carbon market price data. In the European Union, €88, near enough, dollars per tonne. California, 28. Australia 56, New Zealand 76, South Korea 29. So all over the place, you know. Would you then say, oh, we're in North America? Well, let's take the Californian price, but why is it that price? That's the market that you've got. And then you throw in, and it was just at the tail end of looking at those, the aviation industry carbon offset. And we talked about carbon offsets, but yesterday they were priced at $7.39 a ton. So yeah, one of the big problems you're going to have if you're going to go for an internal pricing is, what price do you set? And the idea that it's part of funding your reduction program, I think can work, because you can see how saving in one place then helps to fund parts of the other business. But no business would actually go, oh, let's, charge ourselves another 10% on our operating costs just for the sake of it. So that's where you get a challenge with that.
So I'd like to add to what John's saying. So interesting, John, this may not be a surprise to you, but there's a firm that we work with, they're French, well-known. 3 years ago, the plant manager had an internal carbon cost that they had to incur in their business plan. Like if they're doing capital projects, they had to put in a carbon. So that was 3 years ago. I thought that's pretty forward thinking. And to add, in Canada, like we're projected by 2030 that our carbon tax will be $170 a ton. I think we're kind of leading the field now. Currently, our carbon for 2022, I think it's $50 a ton. So the market is going to escalate every year thereafterwards for our listeners.
Yeah, it's interesting on that, because if you remember when we were talking about this episode, we were, sounds silly, we were kicking around a barrel of oil.
Yes.
And I was having a look at that, and this is where we have to give a warning, because what's in the barrel of oil? All oils are different, and I just want to throw a real wobbler in here. You can have high carbon and low carbon oil. Not all oil has the same carbon content. It's to do with its method of extraction and everything else. But we talked about having just a simple example, so I've tried one. A barrel is 42 gallons, US gallons, about 159 litres. Put that in context. And the energy contained in it is, and this is according to the US EPA, is around about 1,700 kilowatt hours, or about 5.8 million BTUs. So that's what you get with your barrel of oil. Can we make that more accessible? Yes. If you had an average car, you'd be able to drive around about 3,200 kilometers on a barrel of oil. And if you had a typical North American home, now you see the danger with all these figures, but again, this is actually based on the US. To run that home for a month, that typical home, and that's, these are iffy figures all over, you'd need about 1.3 barrels of oil. So that puts a barrel of oil in context. Okay, now let's talk about pricing carbon and what that would have. WTI yesterday, that's one of the two major oil markets, it was trading at near enough $88 a barrel. So if we look, the EPA suggests for a barrel of distillate, there is about 430 kilos of CO2 per barrel. So on that basis, if we looked at it, $88 a barrel, if you looked at Canada's $170 a ton tax, that would add $73 to the price of a barrel of oil.
So quite frankly, almost doubled the price.
Yeah. Now, there is an argument, and we've had it offline. In a parallel universe, somebody would say the way we solve this problem is we tax the oil at point of production so that it's paid for there. Can you see people reaction if we did that? and even a $50 a ton cost, that would be around about $22 onto a barrel of oil. Right. Now, we've got 7-year highs roughly on oil at the moment, and we're talking about that there. Imagine what that impact, because that value of carbon, if you like, those tax values may not change. So if oil price came down, the proportional impact would be greater.
That certainly would encourage people to electrify their vehicle.
Wouldn't it?
if we're paying, I paid for a liter of gas $100.72 yesterday. So you're saying I'm putting 50% on that. Like you could do some quick math and figure out, boy, buying an electric vehicle would be so much cheaper than running a
Yeah,
gas
but
car.
let's go back on that. Do you remember when the federal tax was being introduced? And we did some figures on that. And I think at the time it was less than 10 cents a litre, wasn't it? That it was going to add.
Right.
And the general view was that people would notice it at first, but then with market volatility, they wouldn't be aware of it. But the levels we're talking about, you would be aware of it.
You would, certainly would. Yeah.
Would that change people's behavior? Yes, you would be. Even if you didn't have electric cars, you'd be looking at some higher performance internal combustion engine vehicles. You'd be looking, maybe I won't use my car so much, I'll use public transport. It would change behavior.
Right. I use my bike.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it would change behavior completely.
The way I kind of look at it is if you see many popular commodities that end up running out. So for instance, non-renewables or, a new video game console where they only release so many and then people start to resell them. As things run out, costs go up. And
Yes.
currently we're running out of healthy atmosphere for carbon emissions. So like any other trend in other commodities, the prices for these things that affect our atmosphere are going to go up because we're running out.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I have a picture in my office of a place called Coalbrookdale in England, and it's regarded as one of the birthplaces of the Industrial Revolution. And from that time onwards, we started using fossil fuels like nobody's business. We have yet properly to account for the damage that we have done to the environment with that use of fossil fuels. But it seemed the right thing to do at the time. And we have to take that view. I'm old enough to remember when there was a real wonder product that you would use, and it was called asbestos.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, if you said to somebody, we've got asbestos in our building, whoa, shut the building down, remove it, everything else. Knowledge changes over time. But I think the message is coming through. We are impacting on the climate, and we've got to pay the cost somewhere. Now, one of the arguments could be we're paying the cost through insurance policies. How? Well, when we have natural disasters, if they're insured, the insurers pay up and insurance premiums go up. But again, it's not direct enough and it doesn't cover the true cost of it. We've got over 100 years worth of emissions that we really haven't paid for.
And I
Sorry,
think
that's a bit of a fundamentalist view, but it's a bit of a view that the developing world takes. Why should they
So,
be constrained when we in the developed world are the ones that have pumped all the CO2 into the atmosphere?
yep, understand that. Lysandra, there's a couple ways of doing this, though. Certainly, there's the carbon tax that I think we've talked about quite a bit, and then there's these trading schemes like the cap and trade situation, and we've now modified it here in Canada, certainly in Ontario, where we still have a trading mechanism. John, you have the UA emission trading system.
We have a UK emissions trading. We were part of the EU scheme, but since we left the European Union, we've implemented a separate parallel scheme here.
Right. So in Canada, it's the output-based pricing system that we have, and it's different provinces utilize it or in different ways. But where I wanted to go with this is there's different mechanism so that typically these carbon trading mechanism, it actually does drive emission reduction. Like it's squeezing it, so you have to reduce your emissions like over time. With the carbon tax, it's up to you whether you do it or not. It comes down to the economic cost or impact. They're different approaches. Clearly, these schemes can be very challenging and difficult to understand. So they're normally used for larger organizations, and the carbon tax is normally spread around to people that are in a different group. But there are different mechanisms in place, and they will have to be put in place. And coming back to your point, Lysandra, I am convinced that people who think this will not continue, I think they're going to be wrong. And I actually think the pricing will continue to increase, not only here in Canada, but I think other places around the world as we go along. That's my own personal view. Been wrong lots before, but I just think that's what's going to happen. And the people that get at this and understand this now will be in a far better position and be in a better competitive position than wait till the end. Because I fear if they wait too late, they'll be at a competitive disadvantage. That's kind of my point of view. What's your take, John?
Oh yeah, I think, you know, the expression elephant in the room is often used, and carbon has been an elephant in the room for a long time. I think there are people like us who've known about it, but you need to get to a tipping point, don't you? You need more than a critical mass to make things happen. And we see that that's hard enough in one company or one organization, but we need that globally. We need commitment to that.
I think a lot of times when, we're asking people to consider these situations and consider different ways of carbon tax and carbon regulation, we need to also address the issues to allow people to see that full picture. So what are the issues with monetizing carbon that may be reasons why, organizations aren't so keen on it?
It's not that straightforward. It's not simple, even though we may address or talk as if it's simple, but we do it every day and talk about it every day. So if you don't have internal mechanisms or knowledge or literacy on the topic, it's a hard one to come around or to figure out. I've said this a few times in our podcast, like, in Canada with the increase going up, like it's a 400% increase in carbon tax. And there's a lot of clients that don't even know that. And in the next 9 years, they have no idea. So how are they making future capital investments if they don't actually know that? Like what? And so I think there's this lack of knowledge, lack of literacy. I'm sorry that seems repetitive, but that's an issue. And so the only way that's going to be corrected is that people think that this is real and that's going to continue, because I think some organizations think when politics come into play that maybe the next election it will end this thought process. I do think that is a factor that goes on because it has happened in the past. So I think this idea that it's real and that it's going to continue and that you have to internalize things, those will be critical. And until that actually occurs within an organization, I'm not sure if we're going to make any headway, significant headway. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I think I will add that I think what a lot of organisations will think about is it's something that they don't need to do. It looks pretty complex. There could be a whole lot of admin, but they've been having a free ride up to now. Why not continue having the free ride until somebody charges them?
Yeah, and John, we've been exposed in the marketplace. I think they have the perception as well that this whole carbon management will limit the growth of their company, and that,
Yes,
frankly, is not the case. There's all sorts of tools that you can continue to increase the size and the production of your company. You just have to think and do it differently. And I think there is that mindset that this whole thing's going to mess up their business model. I think that's a big area.
I think that's because despite all what we read in all the learned texts from Harvard Business College and everywhere else and things like that, too many businesses are not looking far enough ahead, that they are focused on what they believe is survivability rather than sustainability.
I think, businesses and organizations, besides taxes, are used to paying for something that is tangible or
Yes,
used for their business or for their organization. Like you mentioned earlier, John, NFTs.
yeah,
We can't really hold them. We can't own. I mean, you can own them. Sorry, but they don't seem tangible. And I think it's hard for businesses and organizations that already don't understand carbon to start understanding the price on a commodity that they can't really envision. And I think
particularly.
that's one of the major issues of monetizing carbon.
Yeah, but particularly when I've just given you a brief example, there's no one pricing point that you can go to. We were talking about oil. We had two choices, Brent or WTI. And we all know what we're talking about. We can't do that on carbon. So we haven't got this globally agreed price, that the marketplace doesn't work in the same way. And I think that's another reason where where we know if something's not actually putting product out the factory gate, then why do we need to do it? And if it looks complicated, well, let's wait. I'm sorry to say, less forward-thinking companies' view will be, we'll wait until we're regulated, or we'll wait until we're taxed, and then we'll deal with it. Right? But we know there are a number of companies, and it's a growing number of companies, who are going, and I think it was Mark Carney who made the point, wasn't it, that what's going on is a massive opportunity for business to get ahead of this curve, to rethink it. And I think you're right, Dave. Some of the people are saying, oh, we can't reduce carbon because that's going to reduce output. They're not looking through the right lens. They're not thinking about, let's disrupt our business. You know, businesses, disruptors come as another business. There are very few businesses that are good at disrupting their own business model, and perhaps some of that's needed.
Yeah, I would agree, John.
So what I gather is that we're just hoping executive boards are in the NFT market so they can start understanding carbon as well.
That would work.
Well, you know what? Listen, all kidding aside, and I think we've addressed this, I think as the younger generation gets more involved, not only because they're going to be living it, but I think they're exposed to things that maybe, how do I say it, that may not be always right in front of them. They can visualize what it is and accept that is a value that needs to be done. And I suspect that's what's going to occur as the younger generation starts moving up in the organizations. And I've heard that it takes a decade to make that happen. So think about it. In 2030, that's when the major change will occur because of that change in management philosophy and people involved.
That's a great point, Dave. I think my generation has been raised on many things that are virtual and not really something you see. You know, just growing up with anything at the click of a screen is at your fingertips. That's not something that the older generation experienced right off the bat. So I think that's maybe could be why we would accept something like monetizing carbon at a quicker rate.
Here's a really simple analogy. I hope it works. Is that like when I get a contract, I got to see it on paper.
Right.
Looking at it on the screen doesn't work for me. So I'm just kind of wondering if that's the same philosophy, how people are working. And you guys, your age, you wouldn't probably print out paper. You'd just like do it on the screen, right?
It's funny you say that because in elementary school, you know, for us, we had pen pals to write letters to, and that's because letters aren't really common in our generation. So for us, doing something like writing a letter is so exciting, whereas, you know, back in the day, that was a common practice. You couldn't just text someone or email someone. You had to do it the traditional route. So, like you were saying, times are changing, and every 10 years, I think we'll see a burst in something new. What are the examples of carbon credit programs? Now, we briefly talked about carbon credit, so if you could also define what a carbon credit is and then dive into some examples, that would be great.
Okay, I will take a simplistic swipe at it. A carbon credit occurs within a trading program typically, or a regulatory program where you may save some carbon or you might do something else, and then that's registered as a ton of carbon.
Yeah, spot on, John. My team define a credit as a right to produce an emission.
Yeah.
The credits only exist for compliance purpose in jurisdictions with carbon pricing mechanisms and emission limits.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You have to have the limits. You used the term earlier, cap and trade. And just in case anyone's not familiar with that, a cap means you have a maximum level of emissions. You mustn't go above that, but you're able to trade emissions. So the idea is somebody who's below the cap has spare capacity, they can then trade those credits with somebody who thinks they might go over the cap.
And every year in this cap and trade emission, the intent is your emission cap gets reduced.
Correct.
Every year, so you're pushed to reduce your carbon emission, or else you have to pay a price.
And that works if the caps are set right. One of the problems is that most governments give a degree of free allowances to certain industries. because the industries go, oh, this is going to be too expensive for us. We will move our production to another country or something else like that. So that slightly distorts it. It was once referred to as hot air within the system. And it was one of the initial problems with the European emissions trading scheme when it started. It had too many free allowances in it, which meant there was enough slack in the market that people could meet their cap by trading cheaper than they could by saving.
It's got a lot of rigor because we have been involved in the cap and trade working for some clients of ours. You have to be knowledgeable about the rules and
Yeah.
regulations. Like this is not a simple, easy, like I'm involved and that's it. There's a lot of knowledge-based rules, changes, things of that nature. You have to stay with it. So it's quite rigorous and it's not a simple process.
Now, you typically need specialist support if you are in a cap and trade system. Historically, we had the carbon reduction commitment here in the UK, and I, for a number of companies, acted as what was called a CRC agent. And I sort of managed their inputs to the registry and everything else, because they found the one particular company went completely wrong and faced enforcement action. And one part of their putting it right was to appoint an agent to show that they were going to do it properly in future.
Yes, that's the same thing here, John. There's
Yeah.
some people would do it on their own, but there's some validity to have an independent source
Yes.
involved in some of this reporting.
Yeah, I think part of that is because typically in those schemes, you've got an annual settle up period.
Yeah.
And now if you've got an expert, they're working with all sorts of people and they're keeping their skills and their knowledge up to date. But if you're just doing it for yourself, it's something you're only doing once a year and just for one company. And so you may not be as on the ball as somebody who's doing it as a specialist job.
And to add, when you have because of this cap situation, you have the ability of buying at different times.
Yeah.
I think John's talked about this, and then you have the ability of selling. So if you're not knowledgeable about the marketplace, if you're only looking at it once, it's pretty good chance that you're not really that knowledgeable on the pricing, and someone could take advantage of that situation. So the more knowledgeable you are on markets, the better for the client.
Absolutely. Yeah, agree.
Well, we've defined carbon monetization as best as we could. We've talked about advantages, issues, and examples. Now, concluding off this episode, what is the biggest takeaway? I guess I can start since you both are kind of like, oh.
Could you?
I would just say, along with anything that's new, you need to just try to stay as much in the loop as possible so that when carbon monetization is available in your jurisdiction, you have some background on it. So that would be my biggest takeaway from this episode is try to stay in the loop to get ahead of carbon monetization.
My comment would be this thing, carbon costs, monetization of carbon, that's not going away. So I'd get on the train and I'd get on soon before it gets too crowded. So I would encourage clients to be aware of that.
Given some of what we've been talking about history, I'm going to put a historical takeaway on it. If you look at how the world has developed, way back we had an agricultural revolution when we started introducing machinery and everything to farming. We then had the industrial revolution, which started the whole problem that we're talking about. We've had what some people might call the information age or the information revolution, where the internet and everything else is coming along. What we're on the edge of, or what we should be part of now, and I don't know whether it's the correct terminology for it, but perhaps it's a carbon revolution, where we look at, we restructure how we do business, but based on carbon rather than other things. I did start off thinking, oh, we had the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. Are we in the carbon age? But that sounds wrong, because we're in the age where we want, if you like, the Industrial Revolution started the carbon age for us. That's when we started becoming big emitters of carbon. We need this next era where we put that right.
Well put. I would also like to remind our listeners that if this is your first carbon episode on our podcast. We also have a carbon tax, carbon regulation, and carbon offset episode, so make sure you listen to those as well. Thank you, Dave and John, for another great episode. See you next week.
It's been fun.
Thank you, Lysandra. Thanks, John. See you next week.
Pleasure.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.